Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. We've mentioned a couple big cases reversing precedents. One of them is the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. One of them is the Loper-Bright decision this term that ended the Chevron deference doctrine to administrative agencies. But another thing, Kim, that I think will be surprising to many people is the academic studies that show that the Roberts Court, which is the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Roberts, who took office in 2005, is not out of line in the rate at which it overturns precedents. Here's a piece of an article from January of 2024. It says the famously liberal court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren from 1953 to 1969 overruled an average of 3.1 precedents per term. And according to this analysis, the rate for the Roberts Court is only 1.6 per term. It's been slightly higher since the arrival of justices appointed by President Trump. Then the rate is 2.2, but that is still lower than under the previous 4 chief justices. And again, I think that's the statistic that gets lost in a lot of the overheated news coverage of the Supreme Court, including some big cases, I admit. And another thing I think that is important to keep in mind, Kim, is this Supreme Court is not forever. And at the moment, the 2 oldest justices on the Supreme Court are Republican appointees. Clarence Thomas, 76 years old, turned 76 in June. Happy birthday to Justice Thomas. He's an appointee of George H.W. Bush. And then, of course, Justice Samuel Alito, who is 74. And so it depends on what's going to happen in this presidential election and the next presidential election, but it's not impossible to imagine some turnover that, again, changes the makeup of who is deciding these cases.
I think the other thing that this obsession with, first of all, is that there's only been a couple, and they have been big ones. But the thing that it misses as well, too, is the very sound reasoning for doing so, meaning that the court, in overdoing it, laid out a very careful analysis of why the prior standings and holdings were so problematic for the law, so problematic for basic principles. Everyone agreed, at least back in the day, that Roe v. Wade was a terrible decision on the legal merits. It was poorly thought out. It didn't have a lot of basis. I mean, you can get into the question of the complications it's caused culturally and politically in this country. But from a legal point of view, for a long time, right and left scholars agreed this was a bad decision. Similarly, Chevron and this Loper-Bright case that just came along, the court made a very persuasive case that this was kind of an accidental deference that developed out of a case, that it was never analyzed alongside the Administrative Procedures Act, which was a law Congress passed to try to rein in the executive branch and put courts in charge of deciding cases and controversies, not regulators. And does anybody really doubt sometimes precedents need to be overturned because they are bad? I mean, I don't hear many liberals out there complaining about Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and the separate but equal principle that it existed. We are a better nation because of that Supreme Court ruling. So sometimes these things are necessary. And then, yes, your point too, it's very, very valid. This court, no court, is ever static. Things will change. They could change unexpectedly. I'll never forget back in 2016 as the unexpected death of Antonin Scalia and the immense political consequences that had in the coming election. So you just don't know what's going to happen. And the idea that Democrats are floating that, well, the only answer to this is dramatic change by stuffing the Supreme Court full of new seats, that's very destabilizing when, in fact, things are going to change and migrate naturally on their own.
After the death of Justice Scalia in 2016, Donald Trump, the candidate at the time, put out a list of judges that he might consider appointing to the Supreme Court. He has not done a similar thing this time. So there is new questions, perhaps, about which judges Donald Trump would consider appointing if he got the opportunity. But Monet, even that very sentence, I think, is part of what is feeding into this Democratic panic about Joe Biden and whether he is up to the job of being president and up to the job of defeating Donald Trump in November, because there was a progressive push to try to get Justice Sonia Sotomayor in particular to retire months ago so that President Biden and a Democratic Senate could cement her replacement. And now Democrats are considering the possibility of Trump in office for another 4 years. Perhaps Justice Thomas or Justice Alito would retire. You'd get younger nominees, younger conservatives, originalist justices on the court for years and perhaps decades. And Monet, is that part of what is pushing them to think that maybe we need to make a switch here?
I think that it definitely is. Of course, Democrats remember the recent example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg holding on to her seat as long as she possibly could and dying unexpectedly, obviously not at a time of her choosing, during the Trump presidency, which then allowed him to appoint Amy Coney Barrett to fill that seat. And that has increased Democratic panic and carefulness about the timing for these retirements. Obviously, they want to hold the presidency at all times and make sure that they can gain appointments. But particularly now that the court has a 6-3 conservative majority, they don't want to give Republicans any opportunity to replace their own justices. And they want to make sure that they're as strongly positioned as possible. And so for those Democratic officials and for those voters who pay close attention to the court, it is one other huge concern, in addition to all the other ones that they have with Donald Trump, that really fires them up to make sure that they're able to win. And if they don't think that Joe Biden looks like a winner, as a lot of Americans increasingly don't think, then they're really going to go into overdrive to see if they can find any viable replacement candidate and have a better shot at retaining the presidency.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.